neglected. And I think that you'll find they have a lot to do with filling in some of the gaps of space. And I would even suggest defining New York City metropolitan area and the tri-state area as a distinct destination region itself. So we're going to start and proceed in the order listed. So as, well, I guess with Edward.
Oops. Hi, welcome. Okay, what I'm going to be talking about briefly is a study of undocumented immigrants in the suburban New York community, whose name will be evident in a minute. It's Farmingville, New York. Name that has grown infamous over the years. As an overview, attempts to regulate illegal immigration in the United States have failed. Federal laws, oops, one step ahead of myself. I've been a resident of Farmingville for 30 years. The debate that raged in the community has sparked the current immigration debate on Long Island that continues today. The two opposing sides in the immigration debate have used the media extensively to move their agenda forward. The immigrants at the center of the debate have not had an opportunity to tell their story in an organized manner. The study has provided an opportunity for the immigrants to tell their story in detail. The goal is to gain insight into the migration experience and better understand the people that are the focal point of the immigration debate. Attempts have been made to regulate illegal immigration in the United States, and they failed. Federal laws that restrict the presence of unauthorized immigrants and their ability to work have been inconsistently enforced. As a result, this has left the burden of dealing with unauthorized immigrants on local communities without clear guidance and policy. Again, I'm talking about Farmingville, New York. Farmingville, New York, according to the census, is approximately 85% white. So when the presence of folks from outside the community showed up, it was noticeable. Farmingville is an example of a non-traditional Mexican immigrant destination. A large influx of undocumented Mexicans migrated to Farmingville beginning in the late 1990s. Farmingville has been thrust into the national spotlight on the immigration debate. In the early 2000s, Farmingville received national media attention due to several highly publicized incidents and the struggle between organized factions on both sides of the immigration debate. Farmingville was also the subject of an award-winning documentary called Farmingville that aired nationally on public television. So basically, what I tried to do in the research questions that were out there: why do undocumented immigrants move to a community to find work that is the center of the immigration debate and rife with tension, struggle, and conflicts? And how do they adapt for life in such a community? I used a qualitative study. It was non-random theoretical strategy. I'll skip all over that. It was an exploratory study based on face-to-face open-ended interviews with 45 immigrants. A 67-item interview guide was developed, and the interview guide was translated into Spanish to meet the needs of the respondents. All the interviews were conducted in Spanish. Interviews were audio recorded and simultaneously translated and transcribed into English. The recruitment of respondents was difficult, and even the recruitment of interviewers was difficult. But let's talk about the people that were interviewed. 42 of the 45% of the 93% of the respondents were from Mexico. Approximately 2/3 were male, 1/3 female. There were no questions asked regarding legal status. However, only 1 or 2 males and none of the females appeared to be in the United States legally. The age range for the males was 22 to 51. The mean age, 33.9. The age range for the females was 19 to 46. The mean age, 29.3 for all, a little younger for the Mexican immigrants. As far as education goes, 34% had less than had an elementary education or less, and 50% had completed high school or had some college education for males. 42% had an elementary education or less for females. 31% completed high school or had some college education. Regarding those who were married or cohabitating, 71% of the males, 64% of the females. When we asked about children, 72% of the males stated they had children back in their home country. 2 had children in the United States, and 6 had no children. 50% of the females said they had children back in the home country. 4 had children in the United States, and 2 had no children at all. So it's quite a diverse group. We had, fortunately, we were able to find both genders in terms of being able to get information out of it. So what do we find? The poor economy in Mexico produces limited opportunities to work and advance. Migrants seek to improve their lives and the lives of their family. And here's a couple of quotes. Yes, I think so. I have things now. If I had stayed in Mexico, I wouldn't have what I have now. Even though I'm away from my family, I have things now that before I hadn't, but I know it's worth it. Another one, my mother tells me that if I hadn't been here, my brother would have never finished his studies. He's going to graduate this year. We also bought a house, and this way they don't have to move around, renting in different places. When they need something, I help them. Yes, it has helped a lot, not only to my mother, but also to my brother, especially to my brother. There are many more stories such as this. Why Farmingville? 50 miles east of New York City, out on Long Island. 42 of the 45 respondents had a direct connection that brought them to Farmingville. 26 or 62% of the 42 cited family members as their reason for selecting Farmingville. 10 cited friends as reasons they selected Farmingville. From the interviews, only 3 came by chance. In terms of the migration of women, single women without dependents appear to migrate for economic reasons. Women without dependents cited connections to the Farmingville community, usually family members. Married women came here to reunite with their husbands. Some married women came to check on their husbands. And there were a few stories about that as well. Living arrangements. Housing where immigrants lived in the past were overcrowded. There were stories of 20, 30, up to 40 people in a household. Government efforts have reduced overcrowding and unsafe conditions. Enforcement efforts didn't force immigrants from Farmingville, however. Housing conditions have significantly improved, but issues with landlords still exist. Right now we are 10 people. Before we were more, but right now the town asks to check houses. Before, the landlords didn't care about how many people live in the house as long as they earn money. But now there are less people living in the house, but they charge more money. So the conditions have gotten a little better and less crowded. What was an interesting finding is, as I said, the community is 85% white. Immigrants share the same geographic space as the white community, but basically live separate lives. A couple of stories. Okay, I've been for 4 years taking my kids to the same place, same bus stop, every day with the same people, 5 days a week, every school year. And these people who don't say hello to you because of your language, because they know you're not from here, and sometimes you listen to them, they turn around, look and laugh, like if they are making fun of you. The second time around has been different. Before, people said, "Hi, how are you doing?" to us. Now they don't do it at all. They look at us like strangers, as if we were here to steal from them. And we're not here to steal anything. We come just to work because we need to help our families. So they walk around the same spaces, but it's basically separate communities. It's funny, the white community was complaining about gang presence in terms of groups like MS-13 and Latin American gangs. But when we asked the workers about the gangs, we found out, yeah, there was a gang situation. It was the white kids picking on the Latino workers there. and a couple of stories. The best thing to do is put your head down and keep walking and have control. I don't want to get in trouble because most likely they will believe the teenagers since we are Hispanic and we don't speak English fluently. Or another one, but you know, there are these kids that congregate around the Kmart and the Stop and Shop. They're 10 or 12 years old and play with their bikes. They yell things at us. They try to offend us and run us over with their bikes. We can't say anything because they're kids. In the end, we would lose more, so we try to go around them because we go there. Because when we go there, they ask for money. Give me $1, give me a quarter. They ask for money. So there's been documented harassment and arrest of teenagers in the area. And despite the rapid response of police, and I know there was a beating back in the day, there's a lot of distrust of the police. In terms of immigration reform will allow the immigrants to return home to visit their families and stay more involved in their family lives. It would allow the immigrants to work legally without exploitation and obtain health insurance, and allow them to have driver's license and legal documents. Getting the time thing here. The desire to return to Mexico. Most Mexicans express a desire to return home. And I think if you asked 100 Mexicans, I'm sure 85 would say they'd want to come back to Mexico. And the whole issue about the way the country is over there. I think us as Mexicans, we do not have the intention of staying here. It's rare to find somebody that says, I'm going to stay here forever. I'm going to bring my family here. I personally would not like that. I'm going to have my kids here. Why? Because I think my life is a little difficult. We'll skip over the immigration theory. Interestingly enough, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which legalized 2.3 million previously undocumented immigrants, is responsible for some of the new immigrant destinations. People were able to leave the ethnic enclaves in the Southwest and move to new destinations and then bring other family members with them. And even increased in border enforcement along the Southwest redirected immigrants to communities in the Carolinas, Georgia, New York, and Farmingville. So in the way of cracking down immigration in the Southwest, it created immigration issues in the East and Northeast. There's challenges. The journey is difficult. There's a whole section in the report about the trip here. Networks in the decision. Again, Latino immigrants share the same geographical space as the white community members, but they're largely ignored, whether real or perceived. They feel shunned by the community members. Despite connections to the family, another number of immigrants feel isolated. And again, there's a number of issues of post-traumatic stress, especially from the journey and some of the traumatic events that happened along the way up here. There's no longer a hiring site protest. The negative portrayal of immigrants has led to acts of harassment and violence, mostly by white teenagers, with a general concern about trusting police. If you were Latino, didn't matter if you were Mexican, Puerto Rican, or whatever, you were targeted and called all sorts of names. You know, my son is a prime example. He's 1/4 Hispanic and being called names in the high school. Let's see. The desire to return to Mexico is overwhelming for the respondents. And I'm saying, according to immigration theories, migrants may move to areas very different from their own to ensure a level of estrangement, detachment, and social distance. As a result, immigrants would avoid assimilation, focus on improving their lives, and eventually return home. And they set goals prior to coming here, and the desire to return home. Again, more study is needed. What is happening in Farmingville today? Well, the spotlight went to other areas and other issues, but day laborers still line the street corners looking for work. The undocumented immigrants live in the neighborhoods, go about their business. Local businesses have cropped up in the community, established to serve the new immigrant community. And whether the community has adapted or just ignored the issue is subject to further study. Just as end quotes, here's a few. I would Probably have to do it again, but it's a dangerous journey, an ugly experience. Someone said to my husband that he prefers to be a poor Mexican than a poor American, and I say I prefer to be a poor Mexican. This was one of the ideas that I had, to come here 3 or 4 years to make money, to start a business in Mexico, and continue studying. But things are not that as easy as I thought. The idea that I had here is not the same as the reality. The reality is something else. And finally, no, one returns to Mexico. The end is Mexico, not here. Regardless if you are a resident or illegal, dead or alive, the end is Mexico. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Briefly, thanks to the Institute for Mexican Studies for the invitation and for such a rich conference, and for accepting a paper that was very transparently about New Jersey. So, my name is Rocio Magaña, and I'm an anthropologist at Rutgers in New Brunswick. And let's see if this works. So the title of my paper is called The Border on Their Shoulders, Border Crossing and the Mexican Migrant Experience in New Jersey. And I somehow find the way, my work is on the US-Mexico border, and I found a way to make it migrate to New Jersey. So let me just read this. The daily dramas that unfold in the remote corners of the US-Mexico border are closer to New Jersey than I ever imagined. Take, for instance, the story of a hairdresser from Hidalgo who described to me how, by leaving little rock markers along the desert trails, she came to realize that her smuggler had lost the way and that they were walking in loops in the desert. Or a busboy from Querétaro who related a story as to how the only border enforcement that he encountered at the line, right, on La Línea, came from the drug cartels, who charged them a fee. And that was not the surprising part. The surprising part was that he was instructed not to litter for 2 days at least. Needless to say, I was intrigued. What can we learn about the border and its effects from the stories that migrants tell about their crossing, from how they narrate those stories, from how they remember it? My work in the Arizona-Mexico region has necessarily focused on failed, future, or ongoing border crossings. And these encounters with immigrants in New Jersey promise something different, the insights of the successful crossing. So in 2001, I launched a small project called Memorias del Cruce, and I began to collect stories like the ones I will present today, stories that show how migrants bear the border on their shoulders. And that is the initial premise, right, of this work, that the border marks its migrants, and that has several implications. And I think I call this the border effect, and I think this is at the center of the translation that we have from Latino to Mexican, from Mexican to illegal. It's not just the illegality of migration, it is a border mark, and we can trace these anxieties to Reconquista fears, to historically through the San Diego Treaty and all of these other things, right? So much in the tradition of Manuel Gamio's quintessential work on Mexican migrants, in the long version of the paper, I present a more complete portrait of some of these men and women and their border journeys. In putting their stories together, my goal is to help reframe border crossing not as an action or event, but as a continuous and transformative condition that migrants begin to inhabit at the border, but which follows them and travels with them beyond the geographic confines of the border and the chronological limitations of their crossing. Again, this is the border effect. So what's interesting about these stories is not just the stories of the migrants themselves, but the multiplicity of contexts and dynamics that they present. So let me then turn to 3 stories from border crossings that come from Central Jersey. Tony. I met Tony when he came to the community center to pick up his son from an after-school program in the room adjacent to the one where I was conducting interviews. A woman that I had just interviewed insisted that I needed to hear his story. So here it is. I came from a small town in Puebla in 1993. I tried coming to the US for the first time, but I didn't have the most important thing you need, money. So I met up with a pollero, a smuggler, who told me and my brother that he would take us to the United States. You only have to buy a ticket from here to Tijuana. I was 16 years old. The pollero said, payment works like this. We take people to Chicago. There, I will find you employment, and once you're working, you will start making weekly payments. We crossed through Tijuana and through a place people call El Bordo, that's really heavily militarized today. Crossing was easy, mid-1990s. It took like 4 hours. There were 20 of us in my group, but there were many other groups. Other groups went through at the same time. So Border Patrol came, they could only detain a few number of people, but Border Patrol didn't come. Then from there, they took us to Los Angeles, to a house that was not waiting for us. They were unprepared, and there we suffered hunger. The worst part, though, was to go from Los Angeles to Chicago. It was so cold, and the van they used had no carpeting. It was metal on the bottom and metal all around. I got to sit underneath a leak, and my leg was literally freezing. I would tell my brother to get closer to me because I was so cold. When we got to Chicago, people came down from the van limping from the cold and the cramps. The smuggler had another 10 people in his house. His house was like an employment agency. I don't know if he received money from employers for taking us to work, to restaurants and other places. He dropped me off at my first job as a dishwasher. I thought I was in Chicago, but I was actually in Arlington, Indiana. I was the only Mexican there. I was mute. I used only hand signals to communicate. I thought I was going crazy. I was 16. The restaurant was on a highway exit and only truck drivers would come in. I was there for a week. The pollero picked me up and took me back to his house, and he found me another job. Normally, with this type of arrangement, they give you food and a place to sleep. I had nothing else but the uniform I was given to wear. The employer pays you, and you pay the pollero. I would keep very little for myself, and it took me a month and a half to pay my debt. My second job was in Orland Park, Illinois. They pay me $140 a week. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, I worked from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. On Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, we would go in at 10 in the morning and finish until 3 in the morning, all for the same pay. It was a hotel with a banquet hall for 1,000 people. There were 3 dishwashers, but there was so much work. We didn't even have time to talk to each other. For those of you doing the math, that's 78 hours for $140 a week, which comes down to about $1.80 at a time in which minimum wage was $4.25. This arrangement still exists. I met somebody who was delivered to a place in Ann Arbor, Michigan, under the same kind of arrangement just about a year ago. So, go back to Tony. Because I was so young, I missed my mother. In that job, I saw people crying for their families. We were so isolated. We worked hard and the pay was little. I left the US after 10 months because I felt trapped, isolated. I was not used to being locked away in a job without knowing anybody or not being able to speak the language. But when I got back to my town, my view changed. I felt the town strange. I wanted to go back. My brother didn't go back to Mexico. So he had been sent to New Jersey to work. They had separated us in Chicago. And the only way I could communicate with my brother was through the pollero. And the pollero had 1,000 things in his mind. He was the kind of person who would fly almost every other day. They would tell you, oh, he's in San Diego today, or oh, he's in Mexico. They would round up people for him in Mexico City or in Tijuana. He would then guide them across the border and then bring them to Chicago. He would take a week for everybody to place everybody, and then he would fly back because this was a gold mine. For my second crossing, I called my brother, quote, here in New Jersey, it is very different. Aquí hay Hispanos, hay Mexicanos. More importantly, they have our kind of food. He encouraged me. He helped me with the money so I didn't have to use the same pollero. I left Mexico on January 12, 1994. I was 17 years old. The Border Patrol caught me once, but I got to New Brunswick, and what a difference from my experience to Chicago. And now it is even more different. The Mexican population has tripled. Before, you couldn't walk on St. Louis Street, for example. There, Mexicans were harassed or worse. Now there's so many Mexican people here, that's where I live. Javier. Javier is the age of many of my students and works just a block away from my office. When he found out what my work was about, he recruited himself to the project, warning me that I wouldn't like his story because he had it easy and, quote, did not suffer. I am from Veracruz, this is Javier speaking. I did cattle ranching work for my parents. My dad had been in the US for a long time. He came back when I was 16 and took back what was his, the land, the cattle. Then I dropped out of school and left for Mexico City, where I worked for a few months. I was 16 when I went back to Veracruz and told my parents that I was going to the US. It was 2006. My dad used to tell me about the border and how people suffered in it, that there wasn't any water and that the dangers were many, that if a snake bit you, you could end up there. So I had an idea of how the border would be. My dad had told me, if you have your water, keep it to yourself. Don't give it to anybody, because if you run out, you could die. So I knew what to expect. I took a bus to Ciudad Juarez, and it was there, and then I spent the day there waiting for a smuggler in a hotel. At 1 in the morning, the smuggler picked us up, and we were dropped off right by the line, except that there wasn't a fence at that point where we crossed. The Border Patrol was nearby, so we had to wait in a ditch for an hour. We were very cramped in there. I got cramps in my feet, and I didn't feel them. Then the smuggler all of a sudden said that it was clear, and we went for it. They put us into small groups, and they told us to throw ourselves on the ground. We were still for a little while. Then we found the gutter, and then we crawled on it on our bellies. We were told that a truck would be waiting for us at the end. We were crawling when we saw the Border Patrol van coming. We were about 25 men and women. We were all on our bellies in a single line up the gutter. Half of the group was already too far up that they didn't see the Border Patrol van. Immigration, which is what they call the Border Patrol, immigration took this half. I ended up by myself in a little pond, and after a while, I heard a whistle, first quietly and then a little louder. So that's how we came together again. We followed the whistle. The smuggler had told us that if we got separated, he would whistle to guide us, and so we crossed. They took us to a trailer in New Mexico, and we were there for a month because of the checkpoints. In the trailer, the men stayed in the living room, and the women stayed in the one bedroom. We would take showers, and they would feed us. It was a ramen noodle soup every day. Sometimes we would make eggs. It would be 1 egg per person and tortillas, but not enough to fill you up. Half five? Okay. But not enough to fill you up. They would give us 3 tortillas twice a day, 3 little tortillas twice a day. And when I got here to New Jersey, I was very, very skinny, flaquito. I was 16 y todavía un muchachito. It only took us a night to cross, though, and that's why I'm telling you, I did not suffer. I was in that trailer for 30 days, and it was too much, but at the same time, it was boring. So I would be in the trailer all day, just watching TV and napping. I would like to point out that Javier was probably lethargic, and that his napping, his boredom, and his loss of weight were the result of this very caloric deficit that he underwent for so many days. Then he says, the day we left the trailer, we were watching TV when they called us. They're about to ship personnel at the checkpoint. Let's go. We were ready. Every day we were ready. Rita, and this is the last of the 3 stories. Rita's a mother of 3, a community leader, and a woman so strong and outgoing. I never suspected her border crossing story would be woven with so much personal struggle. This is her voice. I am from Oaxaca. I grew up among nuns, priests, and books. I chose to come to the US because of my boyfriend, so at the age of 17, I found myself in this new world. I crossed fine through the port of entry in San Isidro. I did not understand the immigration system. We don't talk about that in the South. We know that there is a smuggler, but that's about it. For my boyfriend, it took 3 weeks to cross. I waited for him in San Diego. I could not eat. The food was unfamiliar. I could not go out. I tried to get used to it, but I got sick. I lost a lot of weight. After my boyfriend came, we had to stay there for 3 months with a couple who had helped us cross because they didn't want to let me go. Then we came to New York. When we arrived in Queens, they gave me some cardboard to sleep on. I didn't even have a blanket. The kitchen was right next to where I slept, and I could hear the roaches at night running around. How could I sleep? Then there was a cold. I was like, oh dear God, how is this possible? I was in great shock. I asked my boyfriend if he had family elsewhere, anywhere that was not New York. I am from a small town, and I am not used to the city. He had cousins in North Brunswick, and we came to check it out. When the bus passed the corner of French Street and Sudam in New Brunswick, I told my boyfriend, let's get off here. This is where I want to live. He kept saying, aquí no es. I told you North Brunswick. But I got off the bus, so he had to follow me. He was upset. His cousins had cousins here, and they let us stay in. The conditions there were bad. There were lots of drunks and domestic violence. They actually wanted to do the same to me, but no way. All of that did affect me. I tried to kill myself. I was very depressed. We don't talk about depression among migrants, but we suffer a lot going on from one culture to the other. That assimilation to those of us who are not strong enough is hard. I tried killing myself 3 times. I cut my veins, I took pills. I didn't know how to help my kids or fix my situation. Add to that my family in Mexico. I couldn't tell my parents, who had given me everything, hey, by the way, I cannot send you money. And that was a weekly thing. Sometimes I didn't even have enough to eat. But helping others helped me. There's no time to cry. There's no time for you to cry when there are other people who are worse off than you are. And this is what I suffer in terms of my crossing. Well, the second time I crossed the border, I also suffer all the dangers people face in the desert. But I won't tell you that story. But in addition to the suffering of the dangers of the crossing, we as migrants expose ourselves to other dangers, like the mistreatment of our fellow Mexicans, the whites, and others. and that was Rita. So I don't have, in the paper I go into a long discussion of all kinds of things, but knowing that we don't have time, let me just close with a couple of things. So by way of closing, let me say that these three stories suggest that among the most powerful and long-lasting effects of the border crossing are feelings of isolation and vulnerability. In the deserts along the border, I have argued elsewhere, it is not merely the sun or the heat or the physical exertion that kills migrants, it is isolation. A kind of isolation, seclusion, and alienation from others that can be lethal. It is not the migrants themselves who fail or lack the desire to be visible or to be integrated, but rather it is the entire apparatus of seclusion that we have created for them that puts them in that condition of isolation. A version of what Agamben and others have called inclusive exclusion, but I think there is much more to this than that. Something happens as part of the border crossing process that imprints the border on the migrants, so that when we see these men and women, we don't see parents and workers or neighbors or community members, we see the border in them. And this is, again, what I call the border effect. And this is the one reason for which every time we talk about immigration reform, what we get is border enforcement. So, and that is definitely not to say that this border effect, or that this imprint of the border doesn't go away with time. There are many other things that happen in the process, but the closer you are to the border, socially, politically, I think the worse off you are. So this embodied marker of inclusionary exclusion is in part what sustains our disregard for the criminal wages that they receive, the oppressing living and working conditions in which we keep them, and also our disregard for their overall suffering. You're not calling me out. so anyhow, so the power of these successful border crossing stories from central New Jersey, I believe, is in their capacity to expound the conditions, the assumptions, and the relations that keep Mexican migration steady, illegal, vulnerable, and also highly exploitable. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I also want to thank the Institute of Mexican Studies, Professor Galvez, Leslie, and all the other staff members who made this possible. I wrote my paper and my presentation in English, but I think in order to be as quick as I can, I'm going to do it in Spanish, so I can go as fast as I can from all the things I want to take into account. So I hope this doesn't make a schizophrenic sensation with the English and the Spanish speaking, but let me know if that happens and I'll try to shift. Voy a hablar sobre una organización de mexicanos en el este de Harlem, conocido como Movement for Justice en el Barrio, Movimiento por Justicia del Barrio. La intención de mi trabajo es ver dos aspectos principalmente, uno teórico, que es siguiendo con el debate que hemos tenido todo este día acerca del transnacionalismo, los límites y los alcances que tiene. Particularmente yo me voy a enfocar a la parte del transnacionalismo político, porque creo que es el que mejor me ayuda a mí para interpretar esta experiencia organizativa de mexicanos. Y también como para ver que es necesario, creo que de alguna manera replantearlo, porque casos como el que voy a presentar creo que no entran en la definición amplia que se entiende de transnacionalismo político. Brevemente ahí nada más estoy mencionando lo que se entiende como transnacionalismo, según uno de los autores más conocidos como Portes, ¿no? Aunque hay otros, pero digamos brevemente solo se entiende como los contactos no oficiales entre fronteras, entre los migrantes que están en la comunidad de origen, los migrantes que están en la comunidad de residencia y sus familias y sus organizaciones en el otro lado, digamos, en este caso en mexicano, ¿no? En el espacio mexicano. Y como ya se mencionó, tiene que ver este nuevo análisis con la realidad que se está viendo en ciertos lugares. También fue una respuesta a la perspectiva asimilacionista, en la cual se creía que los migrantes acríticamente llegaban a una sociedad y no tenían ninguna intención de mantener vínculos con sus comunidades de origen. Evidentemente, además de que hay muchos ejemplos de que esto es cierto, y cuando todos conocemos el texto de Robert Smith que demuestra esto en el caso particular de Nueva York, también creo que hay que tener cuidado con lo que Martinello y Lafleur mencionan como la posición esencialista del transnacionalismo, es decir, yo creo que existe y es obvia, pero no es la única y hay que entender que hay un proceso a veces más complejo, ¿no? Entonces, dentro de esa mirada y dentro de las subdivisiones que tiene el transnacionalismo está el político, ¿no? Y también tiene una historia que también se ha desarrollado académicamente. En un primer momento el transnacionalismo político se entendía simplemente como partidos políticos, organizaciones, clubes de migrantes, en este caso en Estados Unidos, evidentemente no solo mexicanos, sino de otros lugares, que trataban de tener alguna influencia política, tanto en sus comunidades de origen como en el lugar donde estaban, ¿no? Muy así cerradamente. Posteriormente se siguió desarrollando el concepto, mismos autores como Portes, que en este momento y sus colegas tenían esta definición más cerrada, luego ampliaron a la cuestión electoral y no electoral. En la electoral es obvia la que mencioné, partidos políticos, casi siempre el caso más notable, digamos, es el de los dominicanos, ¿no? Que tienen desde hace años ya teniendo campañas políticas cuando hay elecciones allá en Nueva York sobre todo, y introducen el no electoral para poder incluir también ahí los procesos de organizaciones de migrantes acá mandando dinero a sus comunidades de origen para desarrollar infraestructuras, como ya se ha mencionado aquí el 3x1, entre otras, ¿no? Y sí dicen que tiene una perspectiva política porque también influye en las decisiones de los gobiernos locales, ¿no? Sin embargo, yo creo que si bien vamos viendo estos avances, hay otros también como el de Eva Ostergaard-Nielsen, que hace ya un análisis más concreto y ya involucra otros espacios, que no me voy a detener porque están de tiempo. Y Martinelli y Lafleur, digamos, retomando este debate y lo que ella propone, nos dan una perspectiva un poco más amplia, en la cual lo que plantean es que ya también el transnacionalismo político tiene que entenderse como las actividades políticas que los migrantes desarrollan adentro y afuera de sus comunidades de origen, intentando obtener algún tipo de poder político y de influencia política. Hacen ya, digamos, no solamente se están refiriendo al aspecto electoral, pero yo me parece que siguen manteniendo como premisa eso, y yo creo que casos como el de Movimiento salen de esa noción, ¿no? Y por lo tanto creo que es importante que sigamos discutiendo el término porque está achicando en vez de ampliarse, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, en ese sentido, tradicionalmente se ha entendido en el caso estadounidense como 4 formas en las cuales los migrantes se involucran políticamente en Estados Unidos, que son mediante sindicatos, ¿no? Lo que se conoce como el activismo étnico, que es tratar de generar algunas mejoras o cambios tanto en los congresos y en los gobiernos de las comunidades de origen como de las comunidades donde están siendo aceptados. La parte electoral siempre tiene todavía una componente muy fuerte y de alguna manera algún tipo de cambios en las legislaciones para que puedan mantener y obtener mayores derechos como políticos, ¿no? Si bien yo creo que eso es cierto, repito, hay otros ejemplos donde se queda muy corto. En particular, hay que tomar en cuenta también la cuestión de la acción colectiva y una visión más, yo propondría, que no me dio tiempo ya de hacerlo y no lo voy a desarrollar, pero también de movimientos sociales. Hay otro tipo de transnacionalismo y de solidaridades que se generan más allá de estas, sin negar que esas existen y que quizás son las más importantes, ¿no? En ese caso, yo el tema que voy a tratar tiene que ver con una organización en el este de Harlem, conocida como El Barrio también, que está luchando contra lo que ellos llaman el desplazamiento de comunidades, de familias, de personas que mediante lo que se conoce como la gentrificación, que es un proceso en el cual, digamos, es un debate muy amplio también de la gentrificación, no me meto tampoco ahí, nada más quiero ser muy breve, pero me baso en lo que Neil Smith plantea, sobre todo en sus últimos textos, y que tiene que ver un componente de clase fuerte, que también es otra discusión que se podría tener, que tiene que entender como la llegada de clases medias y medias altas a barrios tradicionalmente, digamos, de clases populares, lo cual genera un desplazamiento, lo cual genera incrementos en las rentas, porque la mayoría renta. Tiene, digamos, se puede ver como un aspecto positivo que llegan quizás servicios que antes no existían, pero a costa de que las comunidades tengan que emigrar porque ya no pueden pagar esas rentas tan altas, ¿no? El caso de Manhattan es un caso, digamos, paradigmático, no solo Manhattan, también en Brooklyn, en prácticamente los 5 boroughs, porque el este de Harlem es de los pocos espacios de barrios que no han podido ser completamente gentrificados, aunque también existe un proceso de gentrificación. Entonces, Movimiento por Justicia del Barrio nace en ese contexto, ¿no? Para entender dónde está el barrio, digamos, simplemente como se puede ver ahí, está desde la calle 96, digamos, hasta la 125. ¿Cuál es la importancia geográfica del barrio? Que está donde empieza Central Park, una parte del barrio, ¿no? Y por lo tanto el precio de las inmobiliarias ahí pues puede ser muy elevado. Y por lo tanto se requiere y buscan todo tipo de espacios para que puedan reinventar estos espacios de de vivienda y poder elevar las rentas o elevar los costos si es que se llega a pensar en vender, que casi no es el caso, ¿no? Nada más brevemente la cuestión socioeconómica, digamos, y demográfica que hay en el barrio, como se puede ver, estos son datos del 2009, pero no han cambiado mucho. Es una población de casi 120,000 habitantes. Tradicionalmente fue, digamos, de ascendencia puertorriqueña, de ahí obtiene el mote, digamos, del barrio, pero ahora ha cambiado un poco, sin embargo, sigue habiendo predominantemente afroamericanos. Ellos dicen hispanos, en la terminología oficial yo diría latinos, pero lo mantuve así porque así es como viene en las estadísticas que se manejan. También hay un porcentaje, como se puede ver, muy elevado de dominicanos dentro de los que han nacido fuera del barrio, pero digamos, la población mayoritaria es la mexicana, ¿no? Con más de 32%. También, si se puede ver, es una zona donde hay mucha intervención, digamos, del Estado mediante algún tipo de apoyo gubernamental, ¿no? Digamos, de welfare. Casi la mitad de la población tiene alguno de esas ayudas. Y también, como se puede ver, casi la mayoría renta, ¿no? Más del 90% renta y solamente 6%, un poco más del 6% de la gente que habita ahí es dueña de ese lugar, ¿no? Lo que implica que entonces hay una movilidad muy alta de gente que entra y sale todo el tiempo, aunque también hay mucha gente que se ha quedado, ¿no? Evidentemente. Movimiento por Justicia del Barrio nace en 2004, cuando en la iglesia de Santa Cecilia se contrata digamos, a un activista que se llama Juan Aro, que sigue trabajando con Movimiento hasta donde yo me quedé, justamente porque el problema de la vivienda desde antes del 2004 ya tenía elementos fuertes que particularmente tenían que ver con que los caseros no querían hacerse cargo de ciertas demandas que necesitaban la gente que vivía ahí, como la mayoría son indocumentados en el caso no solamente de mexicanos, pero de muchos otros, se les buscaba cobrar o cobros excesivos o cobros que no tendrían que cobrárseles. Entonces, al ver ese proceso, la iglesia decide contratar a alguien que sepa el tema, llega Juan Aro, digamos, y una serie de muy pocos, digamos, inquilinos logran evitar que sean despojados y que sean los precios, digamos, aumentados de sus viviendas, ¿no? Porque lo que muchas veces ocurre dentro del proceso gentrificador, digamos, por llamar de alguna manera, es que después de cierto tiempo, según las leyes de cada lugar, en el caso de Nueva York, hay una cuestión muy compleja que no me quiero meter, pero hasta cierto punto hay lugares donde no se puede ampliar la renta por querer, digamos, tiene que haber todo un proceso burocrático para poder hacerlo. En otros lugares sí, el barrio está más o menos dividido entre departamentos que tienen que tener todo este proceso para poder ampliarlo y los que no. Entonces, la manera que pueden hacer, digamos, cuando se acaba un contrato es de un momento a otro elevar la renta por 3, 4 veces, ¿no? Lo cual hace imposible que la gente pueda pagar. Sus principales discusiones, digamos, y su principal agenda, digamos, política y social ha sido contra la gentrificación y también han desarrollado un proceso, digamos, de solidaridad en México, particularmente relacionado con el alzamiento neozapatista y lo que ahora se conoce como la otra campaña, ¿no? Han tenido una serie de formas de operar y de movilizarse que tiene que ver, digamos, con 4 ejes fundamentales que son mucho trabajo comunitario. Lo que ellos hacen es que van a los edificios y empiezan un proceso en el cual alguno de los inquilinos se acerca a ellos pidiéndoles que les ayuden para desarrollar algún proceso contra algún dueño de los departamentos, y para que ellos empiecen a trabajar ahí, la mitad más uno de los inquilinos tiene que querer trabajar. Es decir, si no hay mayoría, porque ellos creen que esto es mediante asambleas, digamos, son una organización muy asamblearia, si no hay una mayoría, un 50 más 1, es como ilegítimo de alguna manera, ¿no? Entonces, así es como trabajan y eso les ha funcionado mucho. La otra parte han sido los recursos legales, han interpuesto toda una serie de demandas contra diferentes landlords que les han funcionado muy bien. Han tenido una estrategia mediática muy interesante porque son como un bajo perfil, pero han salido en el New York Times, han salido en el Village Voice, han salido en la televisión, han salido en la radio también pública del Estado, han salido en distintos foros también internacionales. En México los han seguido, digamos, de alguna manera importante y han tenido un desarrollo de redes políticas y sociales tanto a nivel local, nacional como internacional, ¿no? Que eso les ha generado lo que han tenido. Particularmente en el caso, entonces me voy a centrar de qué es lo más importante de la gentrificación. Primero, empezaron una discusión, una pelea con Steven Kessner, que en 2006 fue catalogado como uno de los 10 peores landlords de Nueva York por el Village Voice. Básicamente lo que estaban demandando es que él reparara las cuestiones de calefacción, ¿no? Como todos sabemos, en Nueva York, sin calefacción en ciertos momentos es inhumano, ¿no? Ahí tenía de esas casi 4,000 violaciones que se le habían imputado, casi todas tenían que ver con eso, pero habían otro tipo de cuestiones de electricidad, de agua, etcétera, etcétera. Lo demandan y ganan, entonces Kestner tiene que aceptar arreglar esto, ¿no? Que no lo quería arreglar o se los quería cobrar. Él decía que su único problema en el barrio era Movimiento por Justicia del Barrio, pero que a pesar de eso él no iba a vender, ¿no? Sus más de 60 edificios que él tenía, pero unos eran de lujo y otros no eran de lujo, eran para las clases, digamos, más humildes. Pues al final vende en 2006 47 de sus edificios por $225 millones. Es decir, lo que había en juego, ¿no? Y lo que implica que un movimiento se organice y logre que eso no ocurra y que no sean expulsados, ¿no? O sea, nada más para mantener un contacto. Luego se lo vende a una multinacional inglesa, Downey Day Group, la cual llega como una estrategia mucho más agresiva de amenazar a los inquilinos, de quererles cobrar cosas que antes ni siquiera Kestner les cobraba, ¿no? De decirles que les van a dar dinero para que se salgan de esos edificios con la misma idea de, digamos, de arreglarlos y que lo puedan rentar más caro. Igualmente hay una estrategia ahí internacional, en la campaña en defensa del barrio, van a Europa, en particular van a Inglaterra, o sea, digamos, van donde ellos están posicionados y generan como todo un debate público, ¿no? Que genera por lo menos llamar la atención. Aquí entra el factor de la coyuntura del 2008, de la crisis financiera. Downey Day Group quiebra, ¿no? Entonces la ciudad de Manhattan, digamos, se obtiene los edificios. Entonces, bueno, eso al final ahorita está en eso. En diciembre de 2012 se terminó como el contrato entre el Estado, que tenía como un agente intermediario que era quien tenía que arreglar los problemas y no se sabe qué va a pasar ahorita, no he tenido yo como más información, pero digamos también lograron que el Estado tuviera que arreglar cosas que Kestner y que Downey Day Group no quería, ¿no? O sea, porque a pesar de que cambiaron de manos se logró, ¿no? Bueno, entonces me salto la parte internacional porque no tiene tanta significado aquí, sin embargo, lo importante ver es cómo una organización de migrantes, mayoritariamente mexicanos, indocumentados, la mayoría sin tener experiencia política previa, a raíz de una necesidad y de una organización local, digamos, se empoderan, ¿no? Crecen exponencialmente año con año. Cuando yo entrevisté a algunos de ellos fue en 2009, haciendo trabajo para mi tesis de maestría, y digamos, de aproximadamente 30 edificios donde están trabajando, ahorita dicen que están en más de 75, ¿no? Es muy difícil estar con ellos porque no les gusta, ¿no? Es un problema, o sea, porque han tenido muchos espías literalmente, entonces desconfían mucho. Pero si creemos en su palabra, han crecido mucho, han tenido un impacto muy bajo, digamos, en cuanto a la solidaridad internacional, que es un punto muy importante para ellos que ya no desarrollé, pero lo han tratado de hacer. Entonces, esta perspectiva transnacional de alguna manera existe ahí, pero es diferente, pero han tenido un éxito que es primordial, que es el no ser desplazados, ¿no? Entonces, en la teoría del transnacionalismo político, yo creo que debemos de pensar más amplio de una cuestión de obtener recursos y de obtener poder político, sino yo creo que también tiene que ver una acción de resistencia, que es su caso, o entender que no todos los movimientos y organizaciones involucradas quieren desarrollar aspectos institucionales, por más que los usen, es decir, no quieren volverse diputados migrantes, no quieren entrar al 3x1, no por decir que eso no existe, simplemente creo que hay que pensar más amplio y creo que quizá pensar en términos de un transnacionalismo sociopolítico ayudaría para que este debate siga. Muchas gracias.
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for staying for the fourth panel. Right, it's hard for us to keep the energy going, and also thank you to all the organizers and the CUNY Institute of Mexican Studies. Okay, as a gimmick, I try to use Prezi to keep everyone a little more engaged. All right. The title of my presentation is Shades of Gray, Disentangling Citizenship from Legality, and what it means for undocumented youth in New York. And I have to use using this. So today's presentation examines the social life of undocumented youth in New York as they come of age. So that examination involves three questions. A, what is their social life like before they're 18, roughly, during their high school years? B, how does their social life look after they're 18? And then C, what does New York City have to do with it? How are things distinct here in New York? So if we look to the literature when thinking about these questions, we can build on a few key works. Roberto Gonzalez has this process which he calls learning illegality, right? And I like to think of building your aspirations as having kind of like a bow and arrow that you build and you aim in a certain direction, right? And what he finds is that because of all of the inclusionary projects for youth before they're 18, youth tend to build similar expectations, right? So if, I don't know, a typical mainstream American kid would be like the blue line, an undocumented youth in high school might start off in the same way, and then they discover that they are illegal when they're applying for jobs, for financial aid, for a driver's license and things like that. And then they learn how to deal with it. They get poor jobs, and they end up coping with their sort of lost aspirations. So he did this based on an interview-based study of 150 Southern California Latinos, and he looked at how their aspirations are cooled out from their initially high expectations. But with the great heterogeneity in the undocumented population and different responses from different levels of government in the U.S., more scholarship on undocumented youth is needed to explore the effects of exclusion and within different local contexts. So the question is, should we assume that Gonzalez's tracing of the process of exclusion, does it work similarly in New York, right? And I should say, this presentation is part of a larger project that I have comparing coming of age undocumented in New York and in Paris. So I kind of, in my head, I have this second comparison in my head as well, different national contexts. So others examine how patterns of social life change as youth transition to adulthood, right? Arnett and Tanner showed how mainstream youth are taking longer to move out of the home, secure a job, and build a family than 50 years ago. And Kazinitz, Malenkoff, Waters, and Holdaway show how children of immigrants in New York City often stay at home and remain economically and otherwise closer to their families than native youth. And the Suarez and Roscoe's have showed how the dual frame of reference drives many of immigrant youth's comparisons in ways that are different for native-born youth, in that their expectations are made based on comparison to both New York and their hometowns, right, whether real or imagined. Finally, much of the literature, including Portes and Rambat, assume that if you have formal citizenship, you will have access to resources that come with it, right, X, Y, and Z. If you don't have formal citizenship, then you won't have access to them. So this assumes that things are uniform, that they work uniformly across the country, and that localities won't have much of an impact. So to my study. For the last 5 years, and as I said, as part of this larger project with undocumented youth in Paris and New York, looking at both contextual factors and the individuals. Here I'll talk about the individuals. I've worked with 12 primary informants, undocumented males of Mexican origin who arrived in New York City around the age of 11, more or less, give or take a year or two, with one exception. So I'm a former teacher, and I began working in the 2 high schools where I had taught and hung out with the then teenagers in the neighborhood, at church, at home, with families, at parties, right, as many places as I could possibly go. And so in the paper for this panel, I did three types of data analysis that I will explain now. All right, so the first thing is this large inventory of social participation and well-being, right? So throughout my participant observation and in-depth interviews, informants referred frequently to several domains of social participation, right? Family, friends, what they call girls, right? School, work, happenings in the parent's hometown, gangs and criminal threats, involvement in organized activities and events, and when salient, their own mental and physical health. They also spoke of their own feelings, attitudes, and outlooks. Certain informants refer to their apartments and other changes or issues at home. So I took this massive amount of data and tried to systematize it. So I used informant's emphasis and frequency as well as the literature to organize these domains of social participation. So I took 55 different dimensions of social participation and organized them into 11 domains of home, family, education, employment, peers, partner, transnational practices, and civic engagement, right, public life, as well as health, legal behavior, and psychosocial realms, right? Trying to really encompass all the possible really important aspects of their social life. So I'm not going to go into actually what the dimensions are here, but if you'd like to know more about that later, I'm happy to talk about it. So I gave a holistic score to all informants for life before 18, and then a second score for life, between 18 and 22. For each dimension, I scored the informant's practices, outlook, and plans on just a 3-point scale, right? -1, 0, and 1. So for positive outcomes such as housing stability, higher wages, or regular participation in civic activities, I gave informants a 1. Right? For negative outcomes such as housing instability, earning below the minimum wage, or not participating in civic activities, I gave informants a -1. If informants' practices fell between the upper and lower threshold, showed ambivalence, or the dimension did not apply, I did not consider the quality as an asset. The objective here is to establish a numeration of positive social participation, right? Social assets, with the possibility of social factors that impede developing those assets. And of course, the danger of losing social context that comes with such, calculation, numeration. So I do it with care. So a lot of numbers. You're going to see. I'll show you some. Highlight a few in a second. Here are the changes in scores by domain as students, become the age of the majority. So overall, the first thing that strikes me when I look at this is that a lot of the numbers are very low, period, right? A lot of the numbers are not especially close to 1 before or after 18 years old. So look at employment, for example. Low employment scores reflect a more complex scenario in which low-paying work is relatively plentiful, right? Though opportunities for growth are nearly non-existent, right? For education, we see low mean education scores, and that reflects some informants dropping out of high school, balanced by a minority of students who are continuing in post-secondary education, right? Though all the informants can converse in English, ease in academic language proves more of a challenge. But a few of those who do drop out of high school return to school or secure a GED, especially with DACA, which I'll talk about at the end. So driving the change in legal behavior, the gang membership or association of some informants fades as they come of age, right? It's really an adolescent phenomenon amongst my informants. So they also acknowledge police discrimination, but do not report a fear of deportation associated with police presence. So something that people have touched on today in terms of the threat of deportation, we have sort of a different case in New York. Amongst my informants, the NYPD's explicit policy of ignoring legal residence status in everyday interactions and non-compliance with the federal Secure Communities program has created some sense of assurance that immigration issues will not endanger them, even if other issues might, right? And then if New York's dense civil society, there's thousands and thousands of non-for-profits, and there's a lot of immigrant organizations, offer participation in local matters to all residents. The participation in public life among my informants, meaning school, religious, sports, and community organization participation, begins pretty low and then drops after they leave high school. The one thing that really jumps quite a bit, is partner, right? Partner relationships with significant others shift sharply as informants come of age, and most often develop into stable, supportive relationships. Now, if you look at the scores of my informants, 3 clusters appear. High, medium, and low. And I should add that in Paris, informants had much more extreme scores, right? So very socially active and out in the public a lot more, and then very, very, very isolated. So these scores were clustered more closely together. Those with low scores went through some kind of crisis while in high school, right? Family sexual abuse, gang participation, regular domestic violence or mental illness. So now in their 20s, they work at low-paying jobs and are trying to gain some stability in their life. That's sort of what their goal is. Those with medium scores graduated from high school and afterwards found themselves without the resources to overcome the obstacles to education, right? Without having access to federal or state financial aid, and found jobs in the unenforced economy. There was also a third group of students with exceptionally strong educational ambitions, who were supported by in-school guidance and family stability, who attend college, sometimes with transnational resources, including two of my informants who returned to Mexico to attend school there. So I'll go really quickly over this. I also did a fuzzy set analysis, which allows you to look at sort of different configurations of processes that relate to the adult scores, and it happily supported that previous distinction into sort of high, medium, and low, and those categories, those mechanisms I presented last. But before I get to the narratives, right, what people actually want to hear about the most is what makes New York City different. It's a little bit quick. So one is the don't ask, don't act policy by police. A second is the aggressive local policy to not enforce immigration status. A third thing is public transportation mobility within the city. So though there are great limits to traveling outside of New York City, there was a mobility within New York that you don't have in a lot of other places. There's also a dense civil society here, right? We're immigrant-friendly in New York. And as some people who opened up today's conference mentioned, there's, of course, in-state tuition for undocumented students at CUNY campuses, which are fairly close to their house. So I don't have time to go into a narrative. Okay. All right, let me go quickly through this one narrative, 2 paragraphs. So I want to talk about Ernie, whose future really depends on the way the policy is set up. So he's sort of smack dab in the middle of this range of narratives, right? Policy contingent prospects. So Ernie is born in Tijuana. He moves to New York at age 11, 3 years after his parents had left him with his grandparents. And once he came to New York, he enrolled in a bilingual program in middle school and ended up in a neighborhood high school where I was teaching, right? There he made friends with other immigrant youth with whom he shared ESL classes that I taught and a club soccer team that I co-founded. Right? His family, with the addition of his American-born brother, attend the local Catholic parish church regularly, right, with its overflowing crowds. Right? As a senior in high school, he wanted badly to attend the senior trip to Disney World, though he decided it was too large of a risk to try to travel outside of the city and stayed home. Right? So when college decisions loomed for his classmates, he abstained, right, expecting to find a factory job like his father. Other teachers had pushed him to apply, but he abstained, having discussed work options with his parents. I led conversations with his parents and with him about the possibility of attending school, but with no previous college-attending family, the idea of paying $4,000 or $5,000 out of pocket without a clear payoff wasn't logical, right? So after he graduated in 2009, his uncle found him a job in a candle factory. Right? Importantly, he also has a long relationship with a Mexican-American girl who expanded his dreams of what the future could bring. It gave him a solid reason to stay in New York, right? It changed his sort of dream of return, which he would constantly say, oh, I'm going to go back to Mexico. I'm going to go back even without telling my parents and enroll in college there. I want to see the faces of the people who I miss so much. But this girl gives him a solid reason to stay in New York, and the arrival of a son in 2011 further rooted his future here to the city, right? So this brought a halt to his telling me of his dear dream to return, but it did give him some sort of aspirations in terms of family, right? His desire to return for additional schooling persists, though wanes as the years pass, and his desire for greater worker rights has grown. He's changed factories 3 times in 4 years. He still considers being a graphic artist, a tattoo artist, and a mechanic. He imagined taking courses on the weekend. I mean, he still thinks these through very often. And he did apply for a temporary work permit as part of DACA. But his work prospects and spatial discretion might change, but he was the most absorbed in the opportunity to visit Mexico. So I just wanted to close with a quick reading and response to the Langston Hughes poem, Dream Deferred. So, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust over and sugary sweet? I made that. And sugar over like a syrupy sweet. Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? So in conclusion, there's no one response, but employment really festers like a sore, right? As time moves on, the youth really realize what kind of trap they're in and that they can't move out and they can't move up in jobs which don't have a high quality for them. Their educational dreams are drying up as they get further and further away from their high school dreams and also their ability to write essays and things, real things like that. But in a happy note, their family dreams are sugaring over, right? And that people are able to dedicate with the resources from their job. They are able to use that money to develop relationships with partners, have children, and give back to their families. So the very last thing, what might happen if immigration reform passes, right, in the coming months? So DACA, the Deferred Action Program, presents an example of structural change. It brought the youth who had dropped out or who had dropped out of high school back into the loop, and it brought other youth into contact with the local organizations, right? It narrowed the social distance between them and the local infrastructure. It also changed their dreams, right, of being stuck in a job forever, and we'll see how that works out. Thank you very much.
Bueno, en primer lugar, quiero agradecer y felicitar a todos los organizadores, a todos los participantes de este evento, especialmente a Alicia Galvez y a Leslie Martino. También quiero agradecerles a ustedes, pues a pesar de tener uno de los días, el día más caluroso del año y soleado, estamos aquí discutiendo y tratando de entender y cambiar nuestra realidad. Bueno, en primer lugar, I apologize because I also am going to present in Spanish. I wrote the text, it's in English and the presentation is in English, but para tener better time management, I'm going to present in Spanish. El título de mi presentación es Fragmentación y condiciones sociales de los mexicanos en Nueva York, un repaso espacial de las comunidades de origen y destino. Este es un trabajo que he desarrollado por cerca de un año, luego de empezar a explorar técnicas de análisis espacial y demografía espacial, además de haber participado como asistente de investigación para algunos proyectos comunitarios bajo el liderazgo de Robert Smith y de otras personas que están aquí también en la audiencia, y con la participación de varios voluntarios, todos interesados en el bienestar de la comunidad mexicana. Entonces, algunas precauciones preliminares sobre este trabajo. Como recién comenté, este es un texto que todavía estoy trabajando, que espero desarrollar en los próximos años, que se basa en algunos presupuestos. El primero de ellos es que me estoy concentrando en los mexicanos de primera generación. Esto quiere decir todas las personas nacidas en México que viven en Nueva York, especialmente en los 5 boroughs. No estoy todavía, no he abierto este análisis a los suburbios, pero es un paso que voy a llevar allá. Estoy haciendo una combinación de métodos, como se podrán imaginar, cuantitativos en términos de este análisis espacial, del uso del American Community Survey, del census, pero también en observaciones en el campo, trabajo etnográfico y entrevistas que iré desarrollando en los próximos años, con la intención de centrarme sobre todo en la condición de los migrantes irregulares, de los migrantes indocumentados, de los mexicanos, y que principalmente viven en familias nucleares o extendidas. Esto en el texto, ahorita no voy a hablar mucho de esto, pero lo estoy vinculando con la discusión teórica y empírica que está muy en boga entre sociólogos y otras disciplinas sobre la asimilación, la integración, la incorporación social, las discusiones entre la asimilación clásica y la nueva teoría de la asimilación con Richard Alba y Victor Nee, y pues como se dijo en la mañana, con como asimilación no tanto como esa palabra sucia o del pasado, sino más bien cómo constantemente los límites raciales y el mainstream, lo que está la sociedad en su conjunto está constantemente cambiando y no hay una clásica concepción de lo que es la corriente principal. Quisiera rescatar un dato nada más de esa literatura y que es en el que también enmarco este trabajo, y es que en el 2000 el estadounidense blanco promedio vivía en un vecindario en el que el 20% de la población no era blanca y por lo tanto era latina o de otro color, de otra raza, de otra etnicidad. Entonces, parte de lo que yo quiero ver con este proyecto es ver qué es lo que está pasando en los vecindarios, en la demografía tanto urbana como en unidades más pequeñas. Y este proyecto busca contribuir con esta discusión sobre la incorporación social de las familias mexicanas en áreas urbanas. ¿Cómo hacen las familias, a pesar de no tener un estatus legal que les permite tener acceso a otros recursos, puede llevar una vida, puede tener una vida? ¿Qué implica esa situación y cómo hacen para llevar adelante a sus hijos, a los que son la generación 1.5, a la segunda generación, y cómo esto es una dinámica que está cambiando constantemente? Entonces, aquí las dos ideas centrales, y bueno, con esta fotografía también quiero enmarcar este trabajo. Esta fotografía la tomé en Los Ángeles como parte de un proyecto de investigación del Colegio de la Frontera Norte dirigido por Rafael Alarcón, en el que se veía la incorporación de los mexicanos de primera generación. En ese momento era de Zacatecas, Oaxaca y Veracruz. Aquí probablemente vaya a ser de poblanos y alguna otro estado o comunidad. Entonces, la primera idea central de mi trabajo es poner a prueba la hipótesis de una fragmentación espacial de los mexicanos inmigrantes de primera generación en Nueva York. ¿Por qué? Pues porque me interesa saber acerca de dónde y cómo viven los mexicanos aquí, utilizando primero técnicas, como dije, macro, y después yendo al campo a ver qué es lo que está sucediendo. El segundo objetivo es analizar los cambios más sobresalientes en términos demográficos y políticos a través de comunidades de origen mexicana, de comunidades de mexicanos que vienen a Nueva York, utilizando fuentes oficiales, pero al mismo tiempo también fuentes informales y información a varios niveles. ¿Por qué? Porque estoy programando también hacer trabajo de campo en estas localidades, identificar estos circuitos para tener una panorámica más completa. Mis fuentes de información para la primera pregunta, como lo comenté, es el American Community Survey al nivel de Census Tracts, que sería el equivalente en México a la SAGEF, porque eso nos permite identificar con mayor claridad los vecindarios. Por ahora me estoy concentrando básicamente en dos variables que les voy a presentar los mapas, que son pobreza a nivel individual y hacinamiento, cuántas familias, cuántas personas por cuarto viven en Nueva York. Eventualmente también incorporaré educación, empleo, y también voy a presentar unos mapas en los que contrasto cómo se distribuye la población de origen mexicano nacida en México en relación a los nacidos en China y de República Dominicana, pensando en que eventualmente esto también lo puedo comparar con otras comunidades más que también pueden presentar esta fragmentación, como pueden ser los ecuatorianos o como pueden ser los colombianos. También voy a utilizar algunas referencias alrededor de estos proyectos colectivos comunitarios en los que he participado, en este caso para la pregunta 1 o para el objetivo 1, en relación a un programa de educación preescolar con un énfasis espacial en el sur del Bronx. Y para la segunda pregunta, para las comunidades de origen, utilizo las matrículas consulares, esto con la intención de identificar municipios en los que, bajo el supuesto de que quien tramita una matrícula consular es alguien que necesita un documento de identificación y por lo tanto es alguien que no lo tiene y pues podría ser indocumentado, esto me ayudaría a identificar unos circuitos. Obviamente esto tiene un grado de relatividad, pero creo que es una manera de avanzar en este sentido para identificar estos circuitos y estas redes. También utilizo los índices de intensidad migratoria de CONAPO, el de 2000 y 2010, contrasto ahí algunos datos y ya les daré algunos de los resultados que encuentro. Les comento que el índice de CONAPO se compone básicamente de 4 elementos. El primero es las viviendas que reciben remesas, el segundo es las viviendas que tienen emigrantes en el 5 años atrás que estaban en Estados Unidos, el tercero son los migrantes circulares, familias que tienen migrantes que van y vienen, y el cuarto son migrantes de retorno, que de las 4 variables, la migración de retorno, como se puede imaginar, es la única que subió considerablemente entre estos indicadores. Esta aproximación no nos permite identificar estas concentraciones de mexicanos de primera generación. Ya en la mañana han hablado algunos de los datos de cómo la población mexicana es una de las más dinámicas en la región, que ha crecido a un ritmo bastante notable para llegar en 1990 a ser 60,000, a 2010 320,000 de origen mexicano. Este es uno de mis hallazgos. Estos son las 14 concentraciones poblacionales que yo identifico por borough, utilizando las 2 variables, la de hacinamiento y la de pobreza. Se podrán dar cuenta que los clústeres mexicanos tienen niveles altos de pobreza y de hacinamiento, especialmente en el sur del Bronx, con tasas arriba del 35%, pero también hay casos con pobreza muy baja, como en el oeste de Astoria y en Staten Island, que tienen entre 12 y 15%. Y pueden ver también la concentración que hay en Jackson Heights, en Queens, de mexicanos con 38 census tracts. Y comparados con el resto de la ciudad, pues los mexicanos viven en condiciones de mayor hacinamiento y de pobreza. Digamos que es mi gráfica en la que contrasto cómo se distribuyen los mexicanos nacidos en México, que son los verdes, los que ven al fondo, los 14 clústeres que recién les mencionaba, en contraste con los nacidos en China y los nacidos en República Dominicana. O sea, los nacidos en China básicamente tienen 3 grandes concentraciones. Una en Queens, en la zona de Jackson Heights, otra en el sur de Manhattan y también en el sur de Brooklyn. Entonces, yo parto del supuesto de que estas redes de apoyo, estas redes sociales de información, obviamente son diferentes, pero quizá el hecho de que sean más, de que poblacionalmente sean más densas, tiene otras consecuencias. O sea, ¿cuál es el componente, cómo influye el componente espacial en cuanto al desarrollo de redes sociales, de actividad política, de actividad cultural? Creo que eso es algo que es una pregunta empírica que no se ha resuelto, pero que se ve. O sea, que al menos a nivel espacial podemos ver que los mexicanos están en los 5 boroughs, mientras que las otras 2 comunidades no precisamente están en eso. Obviamente hay un montón de maneras de explicar esto en cuanto a los tiempos de llegada y demás. Estas son las 2 variables a las que me referí hace un momento, también contrastando los clústeres de mexicanos con el resto de la ciudad. Como se podrán dar cuenta, Jackson Heights presenta unas tasas de hacinamiento más altas en toda la ciudad, y en cambio en pobreza, lo cual tampoco no es sorpresa, pero es importante señalarlo, y ahorita lo veremos con más énfasis en términos de la política pública de educación preescolar en el sur del Bronx, es la pobreza en el Bronx, donde los clústeres de mexicanos están también dispersos y con altos niveles de tasas de pobreza. Bueno, ahora paso también a dar un breve contexto sobre este proyecto en el que participaron varios voluntarios, en el que se parte del supuesto, el Departamento de Educación de la Ciudad de Nueva York parte del supuesto de que los mexicanos no están yendo como deberían ir otros grupos a la educación de preescolar, prekinder, y esto tiene una serie de consecuencias en su desarrollo lingüístico, cognitivo, social, que son, digamos, negativas y que de alguna manera quieren aumentar la participación de los mexicanos en este sistema público universal. Y entonces la crítica que yo hago, utilizando información del American Community Survey, es que el Distrito 7, que es la zona que ven marcada con una línea azul, es donde pretenden que se desunifique la atención, para que existan escuelas públicas, entonces que ellos puedan moverse de su vecindario para ir a otra escuela. Sin embargo, como podrán ver, en ese distrito no solo hay un número muy importante de mexicanos, que es la parte naranja, sino que hay muchos mexicanos que no hablan inglés muy bien, very well, como lo califica el censo. Y además en este proyecto encontramos que gran parte de los padres de familia a los que apoyamos para registrar a sus hijos no cuenta con acceso sencillo a internet y este programa por primera vez este año requería que toda la inscripción fuera por internet, en línea. Entonces, ¿qué significa esto en términos de una política que habría que discutirse y pensarse más para, obviamente, hacer más un proyecto inclusivo en lugar de un exclusivo? Y la otra pregunta es si los padres estarán dispuestos a hacer esto, a participar de este tipo de iniciativas en los que no sabemos si están dispuestos a moverse más de 1,5 millas o más de 2 millas o invertir cierto tiempo en llevar a los niños a las escuelas, que también es una parte que en el último mapa los puntos representan las escuelas, en lo que quiere decir que donde se puede ofrecer la educación preescolar, pero no sabemos la calidad de estas escuelas tampoco. O sea, como esto es un proyecto que todavía está en curso, pero me parece que es una manera de empezar esa crítica en términos espaciales. Paso a las comunidades de origen, y aquí también hay algunas precauciones. Como dije, mi método de selección es arbitrario, basado en las matrículas consulares. Del lado, de mi lado izquierdo estoy presentando el flujo registrado por la Cancillería, por la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores en términos del número de matrículas consulares desde 2000, y vemos que ha fluctuado entre 800,000 y 1 millón. Y en el caso de Puebla, esto también la precaución, el Estado de Nueva York, la gente que nació en Puebla, que tramita una materia consular, que reside en el Estado de Nueva York, pues es obviamente la que llega casi al 50% para estos años que seleccioné, porque son los años que están completos, no todos los años están completos. Es una base de datos que tiene sus virtudes, pero que también puede mejorarse. Entonces, de ahí escogí 6 comunidades de las que me parecían pueden tener los niveles más elevados de migración indocumentada o identificar estos patrones de municipios viniendo a Nueva York, no a la ciudad. Aquí sí hay que ser muy enfático. Entonces, escogí a los municipios de Acajete, Atlisco, la ciudad de Puebla, Huaquechula, Izúcar de Matamoros, Acatlán y nada más. Los otros ya los dejé. Me disculpo porque esto es muy pequeño, pero aquí esto nada más era con la intención de mostrar las variables en las que estoy utilizando, que es población, número de viviendas, los indicadores de CONAPO, el índice de intensidad migratoria, si votaron en la elección federal, por qué partido fue el que principalmente se votó, por la elección municipal. Y aquí nada más quiero resaltar 3 cosas. La primera es que hay 2 municipios de estos 6 que pueden estar experimentando pérdida de población. Estos son los municipios de Acatlán y Huaquechula. La segunda, como lo comenté al principio, pues que el retorno ha aumentado. Hay un retorno mayor en gran parte de estos municipios. Y a nivel estatal, hoy podemos decir que en el 2010, comparando 2000 con 2010, en el 2000 había 7,000 hogares con migrantes retornados. En el 2000. En el 2010 esto se multiplicó por 4, tenemos 28,000, que en el contexto de las deportaciones de Obama pues se entiende. Y finalmente quiero mencionar los cambios de intensidad migratoria, especialmente en el caso de Atlisco, que pasó de tener un grado de intensidad migratoria medio a alto. Y aquí en estos mapas también que elaboré utilizando esta base de CONAPO, en la parte de abajo, en el recuadro del lado izquierdo, ahí están los municipios que seleccioné y los 6 municipios de los que les hablaba ahora. Y lo más importante que quiero mencionar de este mapa es cómo ha habido una transición en el norte de Puebla, de municipios de muy baja intensidad migratoria, toda la parte de azul, a municipios de intensidad migratoria baja. que es la parte más clara también en la figura de abajo. Sin embargo, también es interesante que hay municipios que tenían una intensidad migratoria alta en 2000, pero dejaron de tener intensidad migratoria muy alta y pasaron a intensidad migratoria alta. Bueno, ya casi para concluir, esta fotografía no solo me recuerda una dolorosa derrota de los Pumas ante Jaguares, me disculpo si alguien aquí le va a Jaguares, sino me sirve como contexto para explicar una de las observaciones que hicimos en este proyecto con participación de voluntarios y liderado por Rose Smith, en cuanto a la desconfianza que existe todavía hacia programas en los que el gobierno mexicano intenta incluir al México de afuera, a la diáspora y toda esta narrativa. Porque el gobierno decidió, de alguna manera, difundir, al menos en este caso, el Seguro Popular a través de la playera de Jaguares. Si ustedes cercan esa foto tampoco lo van a poder ver, pero tiene un logotipo aquí de Seguro Popular. Es un buen intento, pero si realmente se quiere llegar a la población mexicana con este tipo de programas o a la población mexicana en general, pues creo que debería haber otras estrategias más sofisticadas. Y aquí nada más simplemente me voy a referir a algunas de las observaciones que nos hacían en un grupo focal en el que estamos buscando entender qué era lo que entendía el migrante mexicano que era el Seguro Popular, cómo lo percibía, y pues entre las opiniones que recolectamos era pues que digan exactamente lo que sí se ofrece y lo que no se ofrece, que digan qué cubre y qué no cubre, porque había un mensaje que no era claro para ellos, y entonces esto de alguna manera me parece que refleja esa falta de confianza que todavía existe en muchas políticas que no han sido completamente desarrolladas para los mexicanos en el exterior. Y pues interesante también que se autodefinían no como migrante mexicano, no como el ausente presente, ellos se definían a sí mismos como los mexicanos en Nueva York, los poblanos en Nueva York, etcétera. Y finalmente creo que paso a las conclusiones. Me parece que falta desarrollar este concepto de fragmentación social, de fragmentación espacial, entender el origen de esta fragmentación, por qué tenemos que los mexicanos están repartidos y qué representa esto en términos de política pública, y también de nuestro entendimiento de cómo van formando parte de una comunidad o no. Cuáles son las consecuencias de esta fragmentación, especialmente en términos de organización política, de organización social. Creo que es importante tener en cuenta el aspecto espacial en estas discusiones sobre la asimilación estructural. Y como lo dije también hace un momento, este es un trabajo en curso en el que todavía me falta comparar otros grupos, no solamente en los 5 boroughs, sino también afuera, en los suburbios. Estoy por desarrollar trabajo etnográfico en estas comunidades de origen y de destino, con la intención también de identificar esos nuevos límites, esas nuevas fronteras étnicas y raciales, que es algo en lo que hay que poner mucha atención. Y pues la pregunta del millón, ¿qué tipo al menos para mí, qué tipo de incorporación social, qué tipo de incorporación política, qué tipo de incorporación económica vemos entre los mexicanos en Nueva York que no tienen papeles, entre los migrantes irregulares, indocumentados, no autorizados, y quizá comparar el caso de lo que está pasando aquí con otros nuevos destinos. También me interesa mucho ver el rol de los actores en estas familias transnacionales, en la participación de los diferentes niveles de gobierno, y pues como ya se ha comentado aquí, también es importante pensar cómo documentar, estudiar y analizar ese experimento social y político que es el camino de la ciudadanía o el maratón a la exclusión. Gracias.
Leslie, do we have time for a few questions? Oh, gracias a todos. It was very, very interesting. And anyone wants to go to the mic, we need you to just go over there. Yeah, it was really interesting how specialized this field has become. The migration to New York City. We have people dealing with all aspects of the border, of the micro pictures in the neighborhood. It's really very impressive. So, and also the fact that people are doing this in graduate schools and at all different levels and all kinds of institutions throughout the area. It really just shows you this area is just taking off. Senor?
Speak up.
Well, I just wanted to make the comment to the last presenter that I think that there has to be. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment with regards to the last presenter that I think we have to have a little bit of note of caution in terms of how we use the census-based data and also the matriculas. And the reason being is that, and I don't, one of the things with the census is that they undercount, as was mentioned earlier by Baird, not only the Latino population, but also the undocumented population. So, in the case of New York, for example, in the census for 2010, it shows that Bushwick and Sunset Park, the population for Latinos decreased in the census, official census figures, okay? So there have to be some adjustments made in terms of the undercount for, the Mexican population. In addition, one of the issues with the ACS is that, the questionnaire is generally done in English and Spanish. So one of the issues is going to be with the undocumented, particularly the fact that we have, a heavy Mixteco population, is that you have to make some adjustments for, the indigenous population that doesn't speak Spanish. I might also add, and I think a lot of you are aware, that especially, the concept of family in the census doesn't really take into account the Latino composition of family. And when I say that, it's much broader than just the concept of the immediate nuclear family. We have a lot of non-related households, and as you know, there are many male immigrant households where they have a rent-a-bed, and there's maybe 4 or 5 males to a room, and they're just switching off and working, in the daytime and nighttime. So, those kind of adjustments have to be made. Also in household income, the same thing. There's an underreporting of household income. So I guess what I'm saying is that if you look at all these factors, you're going to have to make some adjustment upwards in terms of your overall estimates. And then lastly, one of the things about the matricula cards is that, that only exists for 5 years. And so, you also have to make some adjustments that you're really not having increases or decreases, and there might be people that move, from one location to another. So, you just have to be aware of the limitations of the matricula card.
Okay, thank you. Guillermo?
Yeah, thank you very much for your observation. I am aware, and I know that the census data has a lot of limitations, but and definitely some adjustments can be made, and I probably will do those adjustments. But like I said at the beginning, this stuff that I'm presenting from the census and ACS should be taken with precaution, because I'm also doing ethnographic work in order to understand more complex phenomena that is happening. I know that any sources that you can take, you can criticize and say that it's not complete. But I really appreciate your comments and for this. And in the case of the matriculas consulares, I'm not really worried about being representative in terms of the number, just about identifying places of origin and destination. But it's also well taken, your comment. Thank you.
Again, thank you all to the panelists, and thank you to the audience.
Could I make a brief comment? I feel I'm very uniquely positioned to say this, and I'm not one to fall for nationalism or regionalism, but to all of you thinking about this region, I would like to very kindly invite you to cross the state boundary that separates us, cross the Hudson. We are closer than you think, and without us, your analysis is incomplete. So really, do that.
Thank you.